Ready to go? All right. Okay, welcome everybody. Nothing like ending the day with a little bit of marketing. At least it's light and easy. So this is going to be about kind of how to take your open source project and market it perhaps a little more effectively than you're doing today. Maybe there's some good tips here, I hope anyway. So why should you pay any attention to me? My name, by the way, is Brad Micklea. I forgot to say that. I was working with CODENVY. Now, of course, I'm working with Red Hat since we were acquired. And I'm one of the project leads for Eclipse Che. So some of the things I've done with open source marketing that may kind of add some credibility. Che workspaces have over 7 million hours of usage, which is quite a lot, especially since that only shows public IPs. Doesn't show any of the private IPs. Our web page saw 1 million users, and we've grown contributors by a significant amount from 36 to 98. There's some math there, but I'm too tired to do it. So there's a lot of things that have been growing, and we did that with a skeleton of a marketing budget. It was basically like whatever was left over after we had enough pizza. But the good news is, if you build it, actually they don't come. That was just a movie. So none of that is true. It never works, or almost never works. So the reality is you need to market your project. Now, the good news is that it doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. The bad news is it does take some work. So it's going to be some investment of some kind. So I'm just going to kind of walk through a set of things that in my experience have kind of led to an effective marketing of an open source project. And the first one really is about building the message. And this is, I think you're going to see kind of through all of this, is that work aspect. It takes effort, it takes focus, it takes repeated experimentation to get really good results. So you got to identify your value proposition first. And that's really about what does a user get out of using your particular project. Now, there's a temptation, I think, for us. We're developers, we write something for developers, and so we assume that whatever makes it good for us must make it good for everybody else. It's a very dangerous assumption, because just like any other profession and any other set of human beings, we're all different. And it's important to actually go out and talk to people who are using your product, your project, to really understand, like, why do they think it's important? What words do they use when they talk about why it's valuable? Listen for those and then zero in on them, because a lot of times the words that you use are not going to be the best ones. But typically, if you start hearing all of your users or many of your users saying, oh yeah, I love that it does blah in this blah way, those are what you want, not the ones that you may have thought of first. Some of the rules that I like to use: stay away from adjectives and hyperbole. And the thing that I think a lot of people forget is that it's okay to copy. You don't want to do exactly the same message as somebody else, because then that's not differentiated. But look at what other projects are saying. How do they describe? What are similar projects? How do they position themselves? Does that work for you? Are you a little bit subtly different? And so now you know, okay, so people are used to this message. I want this plus this, or less of that, more of this. It'll help kind of focus your thinking and focus your language. But watch for those keywords, because there's usually keywords in any kind of technical area that you want to be able to pick up on and use so that it clicks for people. The last thing, and everyone who works with me and for me hates this about me at first, but then grows to appreciate it, is I'm a ruthless editor. It doesn't matter if I write it or somebody else writes it. I'm convinced from the moment I see it that it can be half as long. And so that's the initial goal. Take it, make it half as long. And then once you've done that and you come back to it after a few days, typically you can make it significantly shorter again. And you just keep doing that, because you're distilling at that point. You're taking away the extra, and you're leaving only the things that people care about. And that's super important, because if you're like me, you don't spend a lot of time listening or reading to people. You want to know exactly what they're getting to immediately. And that's kind of the whole refinement of the positioning. Now, once you get it, and you get it, and once it's clicking, and you start to see that emotional response from people, that's what I'm always looking for, is if I describe the project and people are like, yeah, cool, okay, I get it. And then they wander off, it's not there. What you need is for somebody to kind of have that moment where there's a pause and they're like, oh yes, actually that is super useful. And then they start to talk about how they would use it. And oh, could I do this? And what if it did that? And but then you want those kind of reactions. When you start getting that somewhat passionate reaction, then you're onto something. And that's, again, how you kind of steer yourself or zero yourself in. And then what is sometimes hardest, it depends on your personality. For me, what's hardest is sticking with it. I want to just keep tinkering with it, but that's actually not great. Once you get to the point where it's actually hitting and consistently people are responding positively, you got to leave it alone for a while, because it takes time for a message to really be absorbed. And you don't see big famous brands out there changing their message all the time. They'll let it sit for months. Then maybe they'll change it and tweak it, and then let it sit for months, and then change it and tweak it. So you've got to kind of have this macro scope where you come back and revisit maybe every 6 months, maybe every 9 months, maybe a year, but it's not every week. The first part is high iterations, and then the second part is long iterations, which doesn't mean you're not researching in the middle, just you're not changing it officially. All right, so let's look at some examples. And I'm not just going to use examples from CODENVY and Che, but in our case, cloud workspaces for dev teams was kind of the big message that we landed on for CODENVY. And that was hard, to be honest, because you see all the text below is really the details under that. And so the reality is that what we started out with as a message was mostly this stuff at the bottom. And it's 2 sentences, and it takes 20, 30 seconds to say to somebody, and halfway through they're like, wait, what was the beginning part again? And you've lost them. Now, CODENVY, for those of you that don't know, existed in the cloud as a SaaS, but could also be installed on-prem. And so we struggled with this cloud workspaces thing. For us, as people who knew CODENVY and lived in that world, it seemed limiting. We were like, what? No, we don't want to say cloud workspaces. We want to say developer workspaces, because then that's everything. But no one really knew what a developer workspace was when we first started. But people had an idea of what a cloud workspace was. So it attached to something that existed already in their brain, and that's valuable. And then we were like, okay, so then, but it's got to be about teams, and it's got to be about development. So you end up with cloud workspaces for dev teams. And it's not as simple as sitting around a table and just doing that. It was a lot of testing that went into this, a lot of going, having things on the website and tracking how people click through and what they click through to. It was talking to people at shows. It was talking to people at meetups. It was engaging people on comment threads, sometimes in Hacker News or wherever, and seeing how do people respond. Did they get it, or are they just immediately off in the wrong angle? And you're like, oof, I did not want you thinking about that stuff. That's not right. We said something wrong, and then you got to figure it out. Another good example is GitHub. And if you've kind of followed GitHub, there's been a lot of kind of subtle, but I think important churn in their messaging from the beginning to now. And I feel like they've really been able to kind of distill down. You'll see a reflection at each one of these pivot points in a big company's messaging where they're refocusing on what they care about now. So you see right away, the developers is huge, because without the developers, there is no GitHub. A development platform, inspiration, these are not accidental words. Open source, business, those are highlighted for a reason. Hey guys, everyone knows we're open source. We're also business. That's what they're trying to do now, right, in their business goals. And so it has to be reflected in this. But they'll leave it like this for months because they feel like this is working now. Manage projects, build software, millions of developers. So no hyperbole, but if you've got a great stat that speaks to traction or speaks to passion or speaks to something which would help somebody kind of be pulled towards your project, you should absolutely use that. So of course they're going to it's used by millions of developers. They want people to know how big it is, just in case you lived under a rock and didn't know how big it was. All right, so let's say you've got your message now. You've got it, it's resonating, now you're leaving it alone. What's the next thing you can do? So the next thing you can do is what in my personal opinion is probably the most important thing, is really obsess on those first experiences. And there's a lot of them. Right? They say you only get one chance to make a first impression. And your first impression is when people come to your site. It's when people read your docs. It's when people first touch your product and run it. It's when people first build your product. It's when people first contribute, when people first commit. There's a series of them. And so there's sometimes too much of a focus just on that very, very first one. and an assumption that after that, it's easy. People figure it out. They're already committed, they'll figure it out. No. There are many of these firsts, and they all deserve to be carefully thought of and carefully tweaked. So some basics, just, I see tons of projects with kind of what I would call mediocre to terrible READMEs. README is not the most fun thing to do in a project. It may be one of the very most important. And you see big projects, popular projects, growing projects, they have clearly thought through their README, and it's not an accident. The value proposition needs to go in there. How to experience your project. And I think there's an assumption that a lot of times how to build from source code is the first way to experience. And for some types of projects, absolutely, that is the right way for somebody to first experience your project. But not for everyone. For some of them, it's just going to be, how do I run it? How do I install it? How do I just touch it? Then I'll figure out how to build it from code. So again, even if it's for developers, don't assume that it always has to start with build from source. Make sure you have the contribute MD, the license MD. Those things need to be there. And then you just constantly watch traffic and try and figure out your FAQ. So for that joyful first experience, there's a couple things you can do. You can obviously make your getting started the kind of top of your README. So you see an example here where they're covering a ton of different content in the README, and that's helpful. And they got a table of contents, that's great. So people can kind of immediately see, okay, there's a lot of good content here in this README. But the very first thing is the quick start. How do I go and do this? Download the latest release, or clone the repo, or install with npm. Bang, bang, bang. You got choices, one line each. Takes 2 seconds to read it, and I can just click down, I'm going. Fantastic. The second option is a shameless plug for Eclipse Che. You could create a Che file or similar, and you're going to end up with an instant experience. Now, my colleague Stephen has a talk tomorrow more about Che files, so I'm not going to go into them here because it's not really about marketing. But check out that talk. It's actually pretty cool technology. But the idea is that without needing to install anything, a user can be experiencing your project in a browser-based IDE in about 30 seconds. And that's really powerful, because what if they happen to get told about your project at a coffee shop and all they've got is their iPad? They don't have their computer. They could type a note and say, go home and check this out, and maybe they will. But it'd be pretty cool if they didn't even need to, and they could just go to the README and see, oh, shoot, I can start this and so on. I'm going to check it out quickly on my iPad. Bang. And then right there. Those moments when people are first engaged are precious. If you can have people take action at that moment, it's way better than hoping that they'll take action later. All right. Bless you. Third, once you kind of have those pieces in place, then you want to kind of broadcast your message. And then once your message is getting broadcast, figure out how to amplify it. And this is a bit of growth hacking. How many people have heard the term growth hacking? Couple? So growth hacking is this idea that you take something and you run a ton of experiments very rapidly. Maybe one a day, maybe multiple a day in some cases if you have the analytics to support that, maybe once a week, but rapidly enough that you can do a ton of experiments in a relatively short time and actually measure the results. And it allows you to do these micro tweaks on whatever it is that you're measuring, and you can end up seeing huge gains. So Sopot actually did an awesome talk earlier today about how he took a single Twitter handle, made tips for using the Eclipse Java IDE, and through many little experiments, classic growth hacking, got it to the point where now it's, what, 350,000 impressions a month? Almost 400,000. And it's one guy and one Twitter handle, and you spend, what, like 30 minutes? Oh, half an hour a day. It's an incredible return on investment, but it took a lot of effort to go through all those experiments. Is a 15-second animated GIF too long? Is a 40-second better? Is a 7-second? How about a 10-second? What if I use these kind of tags? What if I don't use any tags? What if I use, certain @ symbols, @ people instead of tags? What if I connect to this other person? There's all these questions, all these attempts, all these what ifs that you actually have to go through to get that kind of ramp. And it takes effort, but it can be hugely worth it. The key, though, is to start with the differentiated content. And differentiated is important because with social media, with blogging, with everything else, there's a ton of content out there. There is no shortage of content. But there may be a shortage of good content on your area where your project is focused. And if there is, and if you can see that, and you can kind of create your little niche there, that can be very, very powerful, because good content will always kind of find a way to bubble up. It will always get noticed. It may take some time, but it will always get noticed. And once you have that good content, and once it's noticed, then you've developed an audience. Now you've developed a following. Now you actually can really start doing amplification. I like blogs as a good way to kind of test whether a particular type of content or a topic or even a perspective on a topic is going to have traction in the market. And something like medium.com has made this like massively easier. If you're not aware of Medium, it's a really easy platform for quickly writing blogs. The nice thing is you can self-host there, or you can also submit blogs you write on Medium to publications which already have large followings. So you can write something, send it to somebody, and if it gets accepted, hey, that tells you the content was interesting, and it gives you immediate access to what could be potentially tens of thousands of readers of that particular publication. So you can get some real cool traction that way. And then, like I said, hone everything with metrics. And so this is the example I was talking about earlier. All the experimentation that happened, there's an example of one of the tweets. And this kind of end result, which turns out I underestimated. Sorry. But this is incredibly powerful when you think about this as being one little thing that you can do. You know, if this was part of a number of little things that you did, you can see how it can really start adding up. It's quite incredible. Now, the other thing when it comes to social media is it's important to really understand what your goal is with doing it. Why are you doing this? Do you want to find 50,000 people and be able to talk to 50,000 people? Is that helpful for your project? Or is it more helpful to find 50 people who become rabid fans of your project? Those are two very different things. So in this case, this is something that a lot of people don't do, and you absolutely should because it's easy. It takes almost no time. Is tweet out, post, everything. Whenever you do a release, put it up on a blog, basically the release notes, and tweet about it, and throw it on Facebook or whatever other platforms make sense for your world. It's incredible how many people will pick it up. And once they start to, then they'll follow, and then you'll get more traction. It's kind of redoubling. If you're going for engagement, though, it's different. Engagement, you increasingly need to have a bit of an angle. It can't just be, hey, serverless is looking kind of cool. There's 50,000 tweets a day that say something like that. But you see something here, and this is one of the evangelists for Google. He's quite good at this. Obviously, that's why he has his job. After reviewing a few serverless platforms, I can't see the value in dealing with source code. Bam. Now that is a controversial statement. He knew writing this that was going to be a controversial statement. So he gets 49 comments, 114 retweets. That's huge stats, for a single tweet. But he knows what he's doing. He's going to make a statement that he can defend that represents his true position. He's not lying. This is genuinely what he thinks. He's being honest, as you should always be. But he's saying it in a way that is going to generate discussion. It's going to pull somebody in to go, whoa, hold on. I don't buy that. Or, dude, I totally agree. I was thinking the same thing. I thought I was crazy. Cool that I'm not crazy. But you're going to get those views here. And that's going to generate more content, more engagement. And then look beyond the obvious. So this is, I don't know if this would actually continue to work. I haven't played with this lately. But early on in CODENVY days, probably maybe it might have been 2015 actually. A couple of years ago, Quora was used quite a lot. And what I kind of got to thinking is, I wonder if I answered Quora questions that had to do with VMs in the cloud, programming in the cloud, anything that touched the world that CODENVY touches, I wonder if that would work. I had no idea, so let's just start trying it. So I went and answered like 10 or whatever questions, and I was very transparent. Hey, I work for CODENVY, so that's the disclaimer. Know where I'm coming from. But it was not a sales pitch. My answers were honest, and they really tried to say, okay, if you're looking for this, try over there. But if you're looking for a true dev environment in the cloud, you may find CodeNvy valuable. It has these capabilities. It isn't good for these things. You can check it out more here. So not an ad, genuinely answering the question in the context of the question, but trying to bring people to what you're doing, bring awareness to what you're doing. And you can see, like, you can get thousands of views. For a while anyway, it was one of the top referrers to CodeNvy's site was from Quora questions. And it's just something that people mostly don't think about. There's all these things out there. You just need to kind of keep an eye open and keep a brain kind of open for them. Another option, I know a lot of people, once projects get larger and you've got a bit of a community behind you, then the question becomes, how do you kind of engage them even further? And obviously running a physical show like this one is the very best. I mean, people meet in the hall, you have a few drinks, you can talk to people about, and really make human connections. That's the ideal. But this costs an enormous amount of money. It is very hard to run. And we don't typically have either of those things, the time or the money. So what we did is we created a virtual conference. This took basically no money. I think it was actually, I think it was like 200 bucks. Because there was some piece of technology at the time that we had to use. But I think it's all open source now. And so this one, we went in and we said, you know what? If we can get 100 attendees, it'll be worth it. Because it takes very little time to set this up. We've got some good speakers anyway. And that'll be good. If we can get 500, that'd be amazing. We had over 700 in live. And then all those things were recorded, and they've since had tens of thousands of views. So again, huge return for a relatively small investment. The other kind of cool thing is that if you track all this stuff on a weekly basis, as we do, I have like a metric spreadsheet that I have about 50, 60 rows in it, track it religiously every week. I saw that like the week after we did, or the week of, pardon me, the CheConf that we did last year, product usage increased by 25%, which is pretty insane. Like, that's a large percentage jump. And the cool thing is, it didn't jump and fall back down. It jumped and then stayed up. That became the new plateau. In other words, we'd won a bunch of people over, and they continued to use the product. And that's what you want to do with these kind of things, is that injection, that leap. Because otherwise you get kind of a slow ramp. OK, that's nice. You need some leaps, too. Take docs seriously. This is one of the things, developers don't like docs. Nobody really likes writing docs, I don't think. I mean, docs aren't the most fun thing to write, even if you enjoy writing. But this is so critical. To me, this is probably one of the most important and easiest, conceptually easiest things to master. You've got the ability to control it. In most cases, from everything that I've seen, the docs actually does more for your product usage in terms of the users and the number of views and stuff than your site. So if I get 500 more views of my docs in a week and 1,500 more views of my website in a week, I'm more excited about my docs. It's a smaller number, but it's a better number. I know that those are more likely to turn into product usage, and that's really what I care about. So you got to treat it like your site. You got to track it, Google Analytics, or whatever you want to use. But there's a lot of free options out there. Learn how to use them, take advantage of them, and really focus. Because you can guide people in docs. It isn't just, hey, let's throw some stuff up about what the latest thing is. You got to really think about, how do people approach my product? This is in some ways, I think of this as like the roadmap to the product. What are their goals? What are they trying to do when they come to the docs? Talk to them, try and learn that. Or just watch page sequences, which you can do with most analytics products, web analytics. You can see what pages did they go to in what order. And try and figure out from that, oh, interesting. So they've gone directly from install all the way to how to do some kind of administration of workspaces. I wouldn't have expected that. I would have thought they would have played around in the IDE first, but it looks like they're jumping. I wonder why they're jumping. You start to think about that, and then you focus in on it. And so none of this is accidental. We've got, and it's a little hard to read, I apologize, but we've got setup at the top for obvious reasons. But you'll see we've got getting started local, getting started multi-user, getting started SaaS cloud. 3 options. We could have, and at first everyone thought it was weird that I was putting those in 3 different pages, because they're like, they're all getting started, just put them in 1 page. You can have like all 3. No, I wanted 3 separate pages because I want everybody who comes to the doc right away to know, oh, I can do this in the cloud. Oh, I can install this. Oh, it works for multi-users. I want them to see that. I want them to understand it without even needing to read the docs. It should be blindingly obvious. What else? I mentioned Docker. I mentioned OpenShift explicitly. I want to make sure that they understand what container platforms does this work on. This may be a question in the back of their mind. It's a frequent question when we talk about Che to people. Well, what can I run this on? I want to answer that question in my docs right from the table of contents, because it's one of the first things people see and read. User management. I want them to know multi-user. That was a big new thing in Che. I want that to be really, really obvious. So it's the second thing. Logically, I mean, this is probably not the thing that they're going to need to play around with much, but they need to see it. Workspace administration. I want them to be able to understand stacks and samples and all these things. So there's a lot of thought that goes into this, and that's kind of what I mean with all of this stuff. It takes moments of kind of quiet. Yeah? No, sure, of course. No.
Do you also have statistics that show that placing this table of contents on the right side produces better results than on the left side, for example?
So no. The package that we use to do our docs, which allowed us to get good analytics and could be Dockerized fairly easily and allowed for easy contributor input into the docs, it lands on the right side. So that one was not a conscious choice. That was just the package that we used that achieved the majority of our goals, stuck it there.
Which package is that?
This was, I think, oh shoot. Let me look it up. I apologize. It's been too long. We changed like 3 times. I'm trying to remember where we landed. I'll check. So yeah, that was, yeah, so that's the answer to the question, sorry. Okay, so the point that I think is critical here, though, is just that you've got to put that thought in. You've got to really know when you do this, what are your goals? And like I said, part of my goals were, your goal with docs is always to help the user get to the answer, of course, that's number 1. But number 2 was, I want the user to know, what can this do? What should they be thinking about? What's the next thing that they should research, right? Because a lot of projects struggle with the fact that people use them a little bit and then don't continue to dive all the way down, don't kind of unveil all that greatness. And your docs is a great way to show what that greatness is. And then you can ask for help. It's amazing to me how infrequently people do this. But you've got a great community around you. You've got people who use your project, your user community. But then you've probably also got, especially if you're in this room, you've got an entire Eclipse community around you as well. And you'd be amazed what people will do when you just ask them. You don't ask them to do it in a, in a mean or threatening way or anything like that. You just kind of go with them and say, hey, look, at one point in Che's history, we wanted to increase the number of stars because we had seen that if you increase the number of stars in a GitHub repo at a certain rate, GitHub will raise the profile of your project within its kind of explore functionality. So we were like, okay, we want to trigger that. But that means that we're going to have to get a lot of stars in a short period of time. So how do we do that? We were tracking the natural growth of stars, and it was clear that that was just unaided. That was not going to be enough, not when we wanted it to be enough. And so we went to our user base via email and said, hey, look, if you like Che, please star our repo. If you don't, of course don't, or please tell us why you don't. And if you're not comfortable with it, of course, don't bother. Not just, hey, if you want to help. It's one way you could help. And after kind of running that email campaign and tweeting about it a few times over the course of 2-3 weeks, we went from like whatever 300-400 stars to, I forget, a couple thousand, like in a very short period of time. And we kind of hit that goal of getting bubbled up. Now, in the end, it didn't help our business very much. We found that the traffic was not seeming to connect with the actual product. So we stopped doing it, and it's been kind of natural growth since then. What's kind of cool, though, the side effect that we didn't actually anticipate but was interesting is that as this rose, there were a certain number of people that obviously dug deeper. And then we started seeing the forks rise. And the forks rising is actually what is much more interesting, really. I mean, starring a repo, no one actually in GitHub, I don't think, ever uses the favorites function to go back, which is technically what that's supposed to be. The forks, though, represents real work. I mean, people are now doing something with your repo. So that was kind of cool. And I think if I'd done it again and gone back, I would have focused on how do we get people to want to fork the repo. You can't just ask them. That one doesn't work as well, like go fork the repo. It's artificial. You need to have something authentic. But there's a way somehow, I haven't figured it out yet, but there's a way somehow to ask people to help with that that is authentic and honest, but achieves the goal. Oh, win-wins. I almost forgot to talk about this, and it'll be the last quick thing here. You know, good example of SoapPod that you used, I think you were telling me, is you did a bunch of tips and tricks in your Twitter about JUnit. And so you went to the JUnit guys and said, hey, I'm going to be doing this. Can you retweet? Again, just ask for help. Doesn't mean money. You just have to go to somebody and say, hey, I'm going to be showing off JUnit in Eclipse. Wouldn't it be cool if you retweeted it? Because that way the JUnit guy, you know, everyone in your group knows. Fantastic. Huge expansion of audience now. When we did CheConf, we went to the virtual jug people based in the UK and said, hey, we're going to be doing this CheConf thing. I don't know if you know anything about Che, but if you do, it'd be cool if you could let your audience know about it. And Simon was like, actually, I really dig Che. I think it's super cool. So absolutely, I'll let them know about it. And so they had access to several, 100,000 developers that weren't on the Che mailing list. So bang, got exposure to a ton more people. And it, again, doesn't cost anything. It was just, hey, Simon, if you're interested and you think it would be good for your audience, do it. If you don't, of course don't, But it's amazing what you can do when you look for those kind of win-win situations. All right. Thanks very much, guys. Any?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Considering the results you have shown about hosting CheConf 2016, so why did this happen as well this year?
It's going to, actually. Thank you. I should have mentioned that. In my head, I'd meant to mention that. Yes, so it's going to. It's going to be the middle of December. It's just with the acquisition and some other things that happened, it's been a little bit busy. Haven't been able to get that organized as well. So, yeah. If you'd like to speak. Yes?
Did you have or did you experiment with a kind of social media focused strategy, like just putting content on social media, like attacking the three, like maybe Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, which also is becoming quite active in this area, is Facebookifying quite quickly.
Yeah, yeah.
They really attract that kind of content nowadays. Did you do any kind of experiments with that?
Not significant ones. This was, and this is the same problem that every, I think, small budget, small team project faces, is just you have to make trade-offs. So for us, from the early things that we'd seen using Twitter, Facebook was basically a bust for us from the beginning. We were probably not doing it right, but it was clear that it was not leading to good results for us. And so the amount of time it would have taken for us to get good at it, we kind of looked at it and said, yeah, forget it. LinkedIn, we did do some things. LinkedIn, though, was interesting. LinkedIn, we didn't focus on for Che. LinkedIn, we focused on for CODENVY. And we focused on it primarily around customer acquisition cycles and investment cycles. It was, that's a much more of a business-focused social media platform. And so it was important for us to be able to have other large enterprises and VCs be familiar with the CODENVY brand, especially at those particular times when we were executing into those goals. Twitter we always did, but we didn't really kind of do hardcore experimentation or analysis with that like we did with some of the sites. I didn't get into a lot of the review stuff. We got really good results with CODENVY from going to like Capterra, G2 Crowd, alternative to Stackshare.io. There's a bunch of these sites that kind of compare products, and we got a huge benefit from those. So once we kind of landed on those and realized that they were working for us, it kind of deprioritized a bunch of other experiments that we would otherwise have run. Would have been awesome to have more people on my team so that I could have done that, but yeah.
You talked a lot Eternity, actually. Okay.
Yeah, it's not fancy. It's work. I mean, probably again, if I had the time, you could develop technology that would make that easier. It would have automatically populated it, blah blah blah. But it's honestly, it was 45 minutes a week, maybe an hour, for me to pull all that data in. Once you know where to look, it doesn't take long, and then you just have half an hour, maybe an hour to actually really analyze it and look through, because obviously that's the important part. Sticking to a spreadsheet isn't going to do anything unless you really look at it and go, okay, why is this working? What's happening? Look for patterns. So, yeah.
I have a question. Why done webinars instead of CheConf?
Oh, so we also did, yeah, that's a good question. So why not just do webinars instead of CheConf? So we also did webinars. And those were kind of something we did on a more cadenced basis. The appeal of CheConf was more that it was maybe 50% talks by us about Che and 50% talks by other people about either Che or something related to Che. So SourceGraph guys came on and talked about the language server. Patrick Chenezon from Docker came on and talked about changes to Docker and how Docker views developers and why Che made sense within a Docker ecosystem. Who else do we have? There was 2 or 3 more people, and I'm totally blanking. Yes, thank you. Red Hat came in and talked about OpenShift at the time. This was before pre-acquisition, but they talked about what they were doing with OpenShift and why the kind of the Che structure made so much sense in their container native world, et cetera. So we ran it all day. So it basically started kind of, I think it started at like 10 a.m. Eastern and then ran for 8 hours. And we had basically you kind of have two like almost like Hangouts. We used a screencast technology, but you basically have like 2 rooms. And the live presentation would be in this room. Then the next speaker would be getting queued up and ready in the other room. And at the time when it flipped, you basically just actually push the traffic to this room. So for the user, this was important to us, there was no pause. Basically, a presentation ended, thank you, 10 seconds, bang, next presentation starts. So it doesn't give the user time to go, you know what, I'm going to go get a coffee, and then I'm going to go talk to my buddy, and then I've missed the rest of CheConf. You got to keep it going.
What did you use for that?
I think it's Crowdcast.io. I can look it up to make sure.
How large do you think you have to be to approach like third-party people? Because I mean, if you're like a smaller project, probably they don't even bother.
You might be surprised. So I think sometimes there's an assumption that to get somebody big to speak on your behalf, you've got to be big. But really all it is you have to find people who are passionate. And like, Che was not large enough to justify Patrick Chenezon from Docker coming and doing a talk. Like, we didn't pay him, and there's no way that Docker was like, oh, we totally need to be, in this CheConf thing. It was just Patrick had seen it, he really dug it, we'd met at a couple shows, and so just said, hey, look, if you're interested, it's just another way to show off Docker. If you're not, that's cool, we get it. And he said yes, and guy from Google said no, and you got to try a lot of people. You're not going to get, you're not going to have a 5 for 5 hit rate. So you got to try a bunch of people, and you're going to get a lot of no's, but you're going to get a few yeses probably too. Yeah. Cool. Anyway, if you guys have other questions, I'll be at the Che booth on the other side, or just wandering around aimlessly. All right. Thanks very much, guys.